He is a renowned professor, and his research interests include modernism, postmodernism, paranoid literature, chaos, and complexity theories, Western philosophy, and film study. Honorable Professor Hemant sir, please share your
Okay.
thoughts. Please
Okay.
proceed.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. So, my topic is about the emergence of the English novel. And I thought maybe the topic was a bit too diffuse and long for the time that I've been allotted. So I actually thought I'll give a talk on something that I've worked on, that my PhD thesis is about, right? So I'll be talking about uh, uh, science, the influence of science in modern novel, which is uh, generally accepted, acknowledged, but I wanted to talk specifically about physics. I wanted to talk specifically about physics and its influence on English, modern novel in general, because I'll also be referring to uh, uh, Carlo Emilio Gadda, who is also a very important Italian modern novelist. Right. Anyway, my original topic was about heterogeneity, referring to a lot of different, varied influences on the modern novel. Right. So I wanted to actually begin the lecture with what Paul Ricoeur called the masters of suspicion. Right. We have, for example, three masters of suspicion. Right. One being Nietzsche. Right. There's Nietzsche, there's Karl Marx, and there's Freud. All of them rejected traditional ways of looking at things, traditional ways of interpreting the world around them. Right. That is why Paul Ricoeur, in his book called Freud and Philosophy, calls Nietzsche, Karl Marx, and Freud as the three masters of suspicion. I was also originally going to give a talk on the effect of modernity. The effect of modernity. Modernity uh, being a term that is often distinguished, differentiated from the term modernism. Right? Right. It's modernity as a term is about a social condition. It is not about the arts specifically. Right. So it is often you'll often find books that differentiate between modernity, the concept of modernity, and the concept of modernism. Modernism is a movement in art. Right. Modernism is a movement in art. Modernity is a social condition. Right. A social condition. Right. So I was going to begin by talking about Baudelaire's essay, right, the portrait of the modern life, where he first used the term modernity. I was also going to refer to the influence of technology, the influence of technology on the emergence of the modern novel. Right. There's also we can also find we can also find there seems to be some issues with the audio. Am I audible or is there a problem?
Yes, you are audible.
Yes,
Okay,
you are audible.
okay,
Audible.
okay. Thank you. So I was also going to talk about the failure of Enlightenment values, right? Which you'll also find in the in postmodernism also in post-structuralist theories as well. So I was going to talk about the failure of Enlightenment values, particularly the emphasis on rationality, and progress. Right. So the breakdown of Enlightenment values is what propelled the unique disposition of the modern writers, modern English writers. Right. So uh, this was originally what I was going to talk about, but I sort of changed my topic to talk about something very particular. Right. I thought about talking about the convergences, intersections between science, particularly physics, right? Science, particularly physics, whether it is about the laws surrounding matter, right? Laws surrounding matter, right? The structure of the atom, right? Quantum mechanics, relativity, all of these theories, the influence of these theories, which are not so well documented as such, right? We can find an influence of classical science on literature. You can find an influence of Newton, for example, or Laplace, right? Laplace is a French mathematician. You can find those influences. The influence of Darwin, for example, the overwhelming influence of Darwin. Darwin initiated an entire revolution in the 19th century, right? So that is generally acknowledged, but the influence of specifically, say, for example, relativity on the works of modern novelists is something that is not that well documented. Since I've worked on this intersection between science and literature, I wanted to talk about particularly the influence of physics or the theories of physics on the modern novel. Right. Evidently, I have to actually begin with science in general, or the philosophy of science in general. If I have to get to uh, the topic of physics, the influence of physics on the modern novel, I have to begin with the philosophy of science, or as Lyotard would call the legitimizers of science. Right? If you read Lyotard's the postmodern condition, for example, at the very beginning of postmodern condition, you'll see that he talks about science and the legitimizers of science. Right? One of the legitimizers of science, as Lyotard called them, was Ernst Mach. Ernst Mach. Right? Ernst Mach, M-A-C-H. Ernst Mach. Mach was a very famous 19th century scientist. Right? He was a very famous 19th century scientist who also provided a kind of philosophy of science. Right? Primary philosophy of science in order to legitimize the value of science. Right? So Mach. So I have to begin with Mach and move on to Carl Pierson. Carl Pierson wrote The Grammar of Science. Carl Pierson. Right? So Mach. Right? Mach, while talking about science, right, he talks essentially about sense impressions or sense perceptions. Right? He specifically mentions sense impressions in the context of science. Right? What science essentially does is to select, to pick and choose from a mass of sense perceptions, sense impressions, right? A flux of sense impressions, right? What science essentially does is it picks and chooses, right? It uh, takes away certain parts of this flux of sense perception, flux of sense impressions, and tries to describe it, right, tries to describe these sense perceptions, these particular sense perceptions, economically, right? Economically. That is the entire point of science. As such, you'll find that Mark is related with the empiricist, right? The philosophical empiricist of, right, of the 17th 18th century, right? You'll find that he comes in a line of empiricists who talk about uh, particularly sense impressions, right? Locke, for example, in the 17th century, right? Locke talks about uh, tabula rasa, right? Empty slate. He talks about a flux of sense impressions hitting you. Before anything else, there are only sense perceptions, right? Which are then thought about, right? Pondered on and talked about, right? So there's only sense perceptions. You have Locke, for example, then you have David Hume, and then you have George Berkeley, the three important empiricists, right? The three important empiricists that uh, uh, gave importance to senses, that gave importance to senses, right? That gave importance to senses. George Berkeley again is in an entirely different league of his own, right? George Berkeley, for example, completely rejected the experience of matter, right? George Berkeley completely rejected the experience of matter, right? What he believed in was the spirit, right? The spirit is what pervades all supposed matter, right? So George Berkeley, since he was an Irish bishop, he had a very different way of talking about using empirical thought process, right? So Mark also, I believe, led to this kind of descriptionism in the arts, right? It is because of Mark telling them, right? Mark telling that it is usually only a flux of sense impression, a flux of sense perceptions, which are then selected from this flux of sense impressions, right? What science does originally is select certain important parts of the sense impression, certain important sense impressions, and then they talk about it, they describe it economically, right? They use symbols, for example, right? They use symbols in order to describe these sense impressions, right? For example, when an apple fell to the ground, Newton called it the law of gravity, right? He called, although this is a very simplistic, this is probably a myth, kind of a myth. This entire falling of the apple thing is kind of a myth, but still, it's a good illustration to the philosophy of science. What science does is selects certain sense impressions, important sense impressions, and it economically describes them, right? It communicates these senses economically, in an economic manner, right? So science, according to Mark, right? Science, according to Mark, is an economy of thought, right? Science, according to Mark, is an economy of thought, right? So Mark did something even more important, right? When he talks about sensations, for example, when he talks about impressions, right? He does not term them as sensations or phenomena, right? He does not term them as sensations or phenomena, right? Instead of calling these impressions, sensations, or phenomena, what he calls them, right? What he calls them are elements, right? So that there is certain objectivity as well as a certain subjectivity involved. Yes. Yeah. So there's a certain objectivity and there's a certain subjectivity attached to the term elements, right? Because phenomena, right? Experience of phenomena. If you've read phenomenology, you'll understand that it is all about the subject as such, right? The subject who is perceiving these objects, who is given more importance than the actual object itself, right? Appearing in consciousness, right? Phenomenology, phenomena is appearing in consciousness, right? So the these elements appearing in consciousness, right? Uh, in a sense, if you use the term elements, right, it there's a subjective as well as an objective element to it, right? And modern science, right, modern science is nothing but a combination, a fusing of, according to me and according to the theses that I have written, it is nothing but a fusion of both an objective and a subjective perspective, right? Because the old scientific revolution that began with Newton, for example, right? The old scientific revolution, it is nonetheless a scientific revolution. So it began with Newton, right? There is an objectivity that is present in that science, which is in shambles when you talk about the 20th century scientific revolution, right? When you talk about quantum mechanics, for example, quantum physics, for example, right? You see that many of these constants, right? Time and space are constant. These are rejected, right? These concepts of constancy are rejected by quantum mechanics, not by Einstein, by the way. That is again uh, uh, kind of a misinformation, misinterpretation of Einstein's uh, theories. Einstein was never uh, someone who believed in breaking away all the constants. He was never that kind of person. He was, in a sense, a traditional scientist who could not accept the theories, the findings of quantum mechanics, the findings of quantum physics. He again believed in this truth, the concept of absolute truth, the concept of God, right? He was someone who believed in all these things, right? He was someone who believed, he came in line with Newton and Laplace and all the other scientists that followed them, right? So Einstein was particularly disturbed by the findings of quantum mechanics. Anyway, I'll go to that later, right? So sensations or phenomena became elements in the philosophy of science, right? They became elements in the philosophy of science. And next came Pierson, Karl Pierson, right? Karl Pierson in the grammar of science, right? Karl Pierson in the grammar of science again reiterated what Mark had talked about, right? He reiterated what Mark had talked about, right? All knowledge of the exterior world could be had only through sense perception, right? All knowledge of the objective world, right, could only be had through a flux of sense perception, which is then selected from by science, right? If you look at modern novel, right, if you look at modern novel, you'll find that modern novel has an abundance of descriptionism, right? There's an abundance of descriptionism, there's an abundance of sensory perceptions, right? Abundance of sensory perceptions, right? You could readily go to Woolf, for example, right? You can talk about Virginia Woolf, right? Or you could talk about James Joyce. Since I teach James Joyce, right, you will find a very uh, uh, important uh, 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 what do you call it? The first 2 pages of Portrait of the Artist, for example, right, are describing a series of sensory perceptions. Right, the entire first page, even if you leave out the second page, the first section, I'm talking about the first section of the Portrait of the Artist as a young man, a portrait of the artist as a young man, right? It is all about the senses in the beginning, right? Yes, it is providing in microcosm all the major themes of the novel, right, in the very first section. But what you find, right, in the matter of the first section, right, is in fact senses, right? It begins with Stephen Dedler's hearing the story, right? He hears the story that is being told by his father, right? His father has a beard, for example. He does not smell as good as the mother, right? It is also the sense of touch that he talks about, the sense of hearing, the sense of sight, the sense of touch, all these different uh, flux of sense impressions that hits Stephen Dedalus as a baby. Although, if Portrait of the Artist was a postmodern novel, you'll find that they will provide you all these sense impressions as they are, right? But what James Joyce does, in fact, is what science has done, right? What it does is it selects from these sense perceptions, right? A baby could sense a lot more than, for example, the smell of the father. It could sense much more than that. But what James Joyce described was only a part of these sense perceptions, right? One by one, you see the sense of touch, the sense of taste, the sense of smell, the sense of sight, the sense of hearing. All of these senses, all of these 5 senses are portrayed in the first 2 pages or the first section of Portrait of the Artist as a young man, right? Now, Pierson also reiterated the same philosophy that Mark had propounded, right? That Mark has propounded, but he particularly emphasized in this is just in passing, right? In passing, he referred to 2 very particular sense impressions, right? 2 very particular sense impressions. If you've read Kant, for example, you might understand this, right? He talks about the laws about matter. He talks about the laws about matter, right? Laws about matter, and he talks about causation. He talks about causation, right? He talks about causation. If you read Hume, for example, David Hume, right, he has a critique of causation, right? He has a critique of causation, and he has a huge a lot more. He has talked a lot more about this. If you read Kant, he also talks about causality or causation, right? Causality is something that plays an important role in classical literature, right? It plays a major role in classical literature. I'm talking only about classical causation, classical causality, right? Classical causality means every event is influenced by some other event, right? There's the secondary event is only a follow up of the primary event, right? Everything is a result of some other action. Every action is a result of some other action. That is the classical causality that you find in Newton. That is the classical causality that you find in much of realist fiction, right? But when you talk about modern literature, for example, right, the causation becomes much more complex, right? Causality becomes much more complex. For example, earlier I was trying to find this book. I have this book. I don't know if you can. This is. Uh, I don't know if you can see this. Right. This is uh, a novel by an Italian modernist writer, right? An Italian modernist writers, right? Italian modernist writer Carlo Emilio Gadda. Carlo Emilio Gadda. There's also a very nice introduction of this book by Italo Calvino. Right? Calvino talks about, or Gadda, in fact, talks about multiple causation. Right? He does not talk about one single event, right, being a result of another single event. What they talk about is multiple causation, right? Multiple events propel a single event later on, right? It is a single event could be a result of multiple reasons, right? Multiple reasons. So Carlo Emilio Gadda's novel, That Awful Mess on the Via Merulana, right? Via Merulana, The Awful Mess on Via Merulana, is essentially a murder investigation, right? It is a murder investigation where the murder of this rich woman, right, is a result of myriad events before them that happened before them that propelled this particular event, right? So there is multiple causality, right? In quantum mechanics, for example, you'll find that quantum mechanics have completely rejected the notion of causality altogether, right? The way that electrons behave in an atom, right, is completely random, right? The way that electrons uh, uh, function, electron work inside an atom is completely random, right? It could be at two places at the same time, right? So you cannot ever measure the position or the momentum at the same time, right? This is called the uncertainty principle, by the way. Anyway, this is far too complex. Quantum mechanics, quantum physics is far too complex for us to understand. But I give you, I'm trying to give you a certain sense of what they are trying to do, right? So there's a rejection of causality altogether, right? It's all very random, right? It's all very random. That, in fact, is the problem, right? This randomness uh, is the problem that quantum mechanics has emphasized. This is the problem that Einstein could not accept, right? Einstein could not accept the fact that there are random things happening within the atom, right? There are random things happening within the atom. Since we, all of us, all matter is made up of atom, right? All matter is made up of atom. If electrons, the subatomic particles, behave in such random fashion, right, that is the basic conflict that we find, right? That is the basic conflict that we find. Since within an atom things are so random, events are so random, right? An electron can be at one point, it could be at many different places, right? So this randomness that you find, someone is asking me the name of the novel. The name of the novel is That Awful Mess, That Awful Mess, That Awful Mess on the Via Merulana. VIA, Via Merulana, MERULANA. Via Merulana. It's by Carlo Emilio Gadda. 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 Right. Right. So random events happening. This is in fact the basis of the Schrodinger's cat. Right. The famous image of quantum mechanics was the Schrodinger's cat. Right. Schrodinger's cat. I won't bore you with the details. Uh, it was first talked about, illustrated by the problems of quantum mechanics, in a sense, was illustrated by Schrodinger for the first time. Right. So, what are the problems? Right. The problem, quite simply, is that since atoms and subatomic particles are so random in their functioning, how is it that we follow certain fixed rules, laws, right? Right. Since we are also matter and we are made up of atoms, we are made up of subatomic particles. Since they behave so randomly, we should also, it is essential that these two must be correlated, right? They're never correlated, right? We follow certain laws that the atom, the atomic particles, electrons, protons, they don't follow these uh, uh, laws that we follow, right? Imagine something suddenly disappearing, right? We don't suddenly disappear, right? We don't suddenly disappear, but an electron can disappear and go to some other place, right? It can it can be present in two places at one time. In fact, this problem of simultaneity is also found in modern novel, right? The problem of simultaneity is something that that James Joyce was completely obsessed with, right? James Joyce was obsessed with this theory of simultaneity, how to represent two simultaneous events, right? Since novel, right, by its very form, by its very logic, is linear, right? Novel is something that you read linearly, page 1, page 2, page 3, right? But how do you describe, how do you uh, find ways of showing two simultaneous events, right? These simultaneous events are far too common in postmodern novels, right? But in modernist novel, this is a new innovation in a sense. You'll find simultaneous, the obsession with simultaneity, right? As one critic, I forget his name, he called it alternate, this device of projecting simultaneous events, right? Cross cutting in film, we find cross cutting in film for simultaneous events happening in different locations, right? Cross cutting. Anyway, so simultaneous actions, right? Joyce was obsessed with showing simultaneous events, right? That is why in Ulysses, for example, right? Ulysses, for example, you'll find uh, uh, Buck Mulligan and Stephen Dedalus, right, at 8 a.m. in the morning on 16th of June, right, 1904, 16th of June, you'll find them waking up at 8 a.m., right? Similarly, in the fourth chapter, you'll find Leopold Bloom, right? And what he does waking up at 8 a.m. at the same time on the same day, right? In a different location, right? So that is what you find, the simultaneous events, the description of simultaneous events. Right? Now, Ulysses, since we have already talked about Ulysses, right? Ulysses has uh, a very important chapter which is called Ithaca, right? Ithaca is written, according to many of the critics of Joyce, right? Many of the scholars, right? Ithaca is written in uh, in a scientific mode, right? Ithaca is written in a scientific mode, right? Ithaca is where Stephen Dedalus is brought home by Leopold Bloom. Leopold Bloom brings Stephen Dedalus to his house, and they have a discussion. And there's also a lot of catalogs, right? And it is written in uh, in a catechism, in the mode of a catechism, question and answers, right? There are questions and then there are answers. In the answers, you find a catalog of things, right? For example, the catalog of the lovers of Molly Bloom, the wife of Leopold Bloom, right? Molly Bloom, yes. So Molly Bloom's lovers, right? So Leopold Bloom thinks about the lovers, the manifold lovers of Molly Bloom that he thinks about. They might not be true. It might not be true, right? So Ithaca, in a sense, right, is written in a scientific manner, is written in a scientific mode, right? Right. Uh, I don't know how much time I've got left, uh, but I also wanted to talk about uh, the problem of relativity. The problem of relativity. Since I've touched on a bits and pieces of quantum theory, right? Relativity is something that began the new scientific revolution of the 20th century, right? With the publication of the paper on electrodynamics, the paper on special theory of relativity by Einstein in 1905, right? In 1905 he published a paper, and I tried to go through the paper, electrodynamics. Yes, so I tried to go through the paper, right? I could not understand much of the much of the mathematical jargon that you find there, but I did understand the postulates that are provided by Einstein. Right? Einstein had provided two very simple postulates. Right? This is where you understand that Einstein is not some postmodern god rejecting all kinds of constancy in the world. Right? Einstein was as traditional as they come. Right? Yes, he rejected the constants of time and space, but he also replaced them with the constant speed of time, light. Right? He also replaced them with the constant speed of light. There's nothing else that is constant in the world, right? Except the speed of light. The speed of light is always constant, right? The speed of light is always constant. No matter where you project the light, no matter what direction the light is traveling, it always travels at the same speed, right? So this relativity theory was never actually called relativity theory, at least in the beginning phases. Right? It was called relativity theory much later, maybe the end of maybe end of 1920 maybe. Right? So relativity was used by Einstein, but much later. Right? The actual terms that he used at the beginning were the exact opposite of relativity, right? The exact opposite of relativity. He talked about irrelativity. He talked about invariant theory, right? He talked about invariant theory. His special theory of relativity was actually invariant. It was actually invariant theory. It was actually irrelativity, right? He's not saying that he's not talking about some kind of moral relativism that it has been interpreted in today's world, right? Yes, he does talk about separate frames of reference. It does talk about separate frames of reference, but he does not say that each perspective that you have, right, is could be true or is true in any sense, right? What he's saying essentially is that there is a fixed eternal truth. There is always a fixed eternal truth. All we could find as individual perceptors are parts of that eternal truth, right? There is relativity. Yes, there is relativity, but at the same time there is a kind of unity that you find if you collect all the different perspectives, all the different perceptors, or all the different perspectives, join them together, you have an understanding of eternal truth. right? Eternal truth. So he was completely disturbed in a sense by quantum mechanics. Anyway, so relativity, there's relativity and there is unity at the same time. So you cannot always talk about moral relativism of some kind, right? So this is my location, I'm also right and you are also right. This does not simply work uh, for Einstein anyway, right? If you're going to use Einstein, you have to know the actual theory of Einstein, right? So relativity and unity, right? The aspect of relativity, again, I'll be referring to James Joyce because that is what I've worked on. So relativity is found in the aspect of uh, perspectival narration that you find in James Joyce's novels. Right? I'll give you an example of this. Perspectives, different perspectives on the same event, about the same event. Right? There is, for example, in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, you'll find this incident. In the first chapter, you find an incident at the end of first chapter, right? The Pandibat incident, right? And Stephen Douglas goes and complains to the rector of Clongoveswood College, Father Conmee, right? Father Conmee is the rector of the school that he is studying in. He goes and complains about Father Dolan. Father Dolan is the one who hit him, right? Who punished him. So that incident uh, is a kind of a small victory for Stephen Douglas in the novel. Right? It is a small victory at the end of the first novel. It is a small victory for Stephen Douglas because after complaining about Father Dolan, he comes back running to the field where other students are playing cricket, and they ask him what happened, and he says, I've complained, and he's going to look after the incident. Right? He's going to talk to Father Dolan, and everyone takes Stephen Douglas on their shoulders and go around the ground. Right? It is a small victory, but the same event, right? The same event is looked from a different lens, right? In the same novel, right? I believe it is the second chapter of either, is it second? Maybe the second chapter or the third chapter. Right? In the second chapter, I believe, right, you'll find this same episode, right, being talked about from a different lens. Right? You find the same event talked about from a different lens. Right? This lens is provided from by the father of Stephen Douglas, Simon Douglas. Simon Douglas had met Father Conmee, and this is in the second chapter. Yes, this is the second chapter. Right? Second chapter when Simon Douglas has lost much of his inheritance, right? Much of his money, and Stephen Douglas had to leave Clongoveswood College. In order to get admitted to Belvedere College, he needed the recommendation of Father Conmee. So Father Conmee met Simon Douglas, and Father Conmee has a different uh, uh, gives a different narration of the same incident. Right? Gives a different narration of the same incident. So there are perspectival elements. Yes, Sound and Fury, Faulkner. Right? Sound and Fury, you'll also find it in As I Lay Dying in Faulkner. Right? As I Lay Dying, each of the chapters have different narrators. Right? Anyway, so there, right now, yes, right now I'm talking about uh, uh, James Joyce. Right? So there are perspectival elements that you find in the novels of James Joyce. At the same time, you have certain unities that you find in James Joyce. Right? There are certain unities that you find in James Joyce. Epiphany, as everyone knows. Right? It's a synthesis of meaning. Right? Epiphany is a synthesis of meaning. Right? You'll also find uh, what uh, what Joyce calls the Akashic records. Right? He calls them the Akashic records, the universal memory. Right? everything is, in a sense, right, part of the universal memory. Everything that you have said, everything that you have done, everything is a part of this universal memory that Joyce believed in. Right? Joyce believed in this concept of the universal memory, Akashic records, Akash. Right? Anyway, so he also believed in this theory of correspondences that you find again in the first section of Portrait. Right? The theory of correspondence is simply talks about the sympathy between the microcosm, sympathy that exists between the microcosm and the macrocosm. Right? And in Portrait, for example, in the first section is an enumeration of all the major themes of the novel. Right? If you read the first two pages, the first section of Portrait, you find all the major themes of the novel that you find later on while reading the novel. You find Irish nationalism, you find the institution of family, right? You find the institution of religion, right? You find all these things, the troubles, right? The description of uh, the fear of punishment, the fear of hell. These are all that you find in the first section itself. If you read the first section, you know all the themes of the novel, right? Which are explicated, which are described in detail in the novel later on, right? So this is where I want to end the discussion. There's also chaos and complexity theories, but they came much later with the invention of computers, for example, right? For the war, in the Second World War, after Second World War, you have the invention of computers, and that gave in uh, that again complicated things. So that is again part of postmodernism. So I don't want to talk about chaos and complexity theories. For the time being, relativity theory, quantum mechanics played an important role. You would actually find mention of books on relativity theory being used, being read by the modern writers. Right? D.H. Lawrence, for example, asked one of his friends for a simple book, since relativity theory obviously is complicated, mathematically, scientifically complicated text. So he wanted a simple explication of the theories of relativity, and his friend, in fact, obliged and provided him with Einstein's own non-scientific account of relativity. Right? You can find that book online as well. Right? There's a non-scientific account of relativity written by Einstein himself. Right? So you'll find that online. D.H. Lawrence. Then you have Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf never acknowledged that she had read Einstein, but you will find in the library that she and her husband owned, you will find a copy of uh, a book on relativity. Right? T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound also were informed by one of their friends who was himself a of popularizer of science. Right? So I think his name was Sullivan. So he was the one who provided an account of relativity, who explained to them account of relativity. So you will find certain influences. Maybe they're not that explicit, but there are influences. Right. So I want to end the lecture here, and I hope that uh, it was informative and uh, it helps up open an entirely new uh, area of research, because uh, I believe that in India there is far too much separation between science and arts. It is dangerous, right? It is dangerous. And coming from central universities and studying outside home for a long time, I've been outside my house for almost 20 years now, more than 20 years. So I do understand the problems that we face. Right? There is so much separation between arts and science that neither party can understand each other, right? So I believe that there has to be certain as CP Snow, for example, talks about the two cultures. CP Snow talks about building bridges between arts and sciences because they've been separated for far too long, right? So my thesis was actually on this. My thesis was actually on quantum mechanics, chaos and complexity theory, relativity applied to a postmodern writer, not a postmodern writer, a, a counterculture writer, American counterculture writer. Okay, so I'm going to stop here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Huh.
you,
Huh, huh,
Dr. Hemant sir, for
huh,
his overwhelming lectures on modern novel.
huh. Thank you. Thank you.
Now, now the floor is open for interactive session. Anyone who wants to ask any questions to Hemant sir, you may ask. And when you ask any question, you have to follow some technicalities. First of all, you have to unmute yourself, and you may ask, then unmute it, and wait for the answer. Please, any one of you.
Hello. I can't hear you clearly, actually.
Hello,
Huh.
you are not audible.
I can hear
Yes,
you, but I can't
you
hear
are not
the.
audible, ma'am.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am, you are not audible properly. Hello.
Okay. So let me just. Okay, I'll ask later. Let someone else ask. I'm a
Yes,
little.
Can you?
someone has actually asked in the comments about multiple endings. So multiple endings is not something that I don't exactly know whether you could find a correlation with scientific theories. I will have to find out about it. Although chaos and complexity theories talks about interconnections, right? It talks about interconnections between everything, right? If you have seen this film called Ship of Theseus, right? There's a film called Ship of Theseus which talks about this interconnection, right? Whatever you do influences some aspect of life or someone else's life. Everything is related with everything else, but I don't know much about multiple endings. Multiple endings you find in John Fowles novel French Lieutenant's Woman. There are two endings at the end of the novel. I believe there are maybe more than two endings in the film version of it. I have not seen the film version, but since I've read the novel, there are two separate endings. Since John Fowles is considered to be again a part of postmodernism, right? I can't find multiple endings uh, in modern literature. So maybe I have to read about it. So multiple endings in modern literature, as far as I know, I'll have to find about it. But postmodernism, you'll find a lot of multiple endings. And I don't know how to correlate that with scientific theories as such. Okay.
Hello. Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good morning, sir. It was a very nice paper.
Thank you.
And yeah, my question basically is related to that theory of simultaneity that you just talked about.
Hmm.
I was wondering if James Joyce's A Portrait, being a Kunstel Roman,
Huh.
has its significance that if it is the growth, if we are talking about the growth and development of a certain individual
Hmm.
during the various phases of his life,
Huh.
is that theory of simultaneity applicable to only such novels, or we can apply it to the modern novels that are at hand, or that we are going through nowadays, or it
See,
just brings.
as far as I
Yeah.
know, simultaneity was a concern in modern novels, not only modern novels but modern literature as a whole. Even T.S. Eliot was concerned with this concept of simultaneity, how to show two simultaneous events, right? How to show two simultaneous actions. Even T.S. Eliot was obsessed about it, right? How they chose to describe, show them, narrate them is uh, what is important. Anyway, simultaneous actions are a part of many of, in fact, many of the modern novels. Uh, you'll find that in Joyce particularly, you'll find this concept of simultaneous action. But I'll have to actually go through all the, since my work mainly focused on James Joyce, I could tell about
On
James
James
Joyce.
Joyce. Yeah.
Right. But
Yeah.
other
Right.
novelists, I'll have to find out whether other
Yeah,
novelists
it's
have
okay.
talked about it. But the development, in a sense, is not simultaneous in a sense.
Okay.
Right? But there is what you
Okay.
find as a fusion of past and present. This is again related to the theory of light by Einstein.
Hmm. So one more thing, because we are talking about James Joyce at length, I just have this curiosity that many in his novels, this name Stephen appears, like a Stephen Hero, and then there was this Stephen Dedalus. So
Yeah.
is it a coincidence, or is there something, of historicity or something kind of like, why is this
Yes,
name
yes. There is
appearing
a
time and again?
historical significance of Stephen, the name Stephen,
Yeah. Hmm.
even Daedalus. Right. As I told you, there's a fusion of the past and the present.
And present, yeah.
Right. There's a fusion of the past and present. So
Mm-hmm.
Stephen essentially refers to Saint Stephen. Saint
Okay.
Stephen was the first
Yeah.
Christian martyr,
Christian matters, yeah.
right? So that
Mm-hmm.
is the reference to
Mm.
Stephen, and you'll
Then,
find, huh,
yeah.
huh, huh.
And then why is he bringing Stephen and that Daedalus guy together? You
He's
know?
bringing them together because
Yeah.
the major themes of the novel are, in a sense, religion, Catholic religion
Mm.
specifically,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
So there's a religious aspect involved in portrait. That is why you have Saint Stephen, and there is
Mm. Daedalus.
an
Yeah.
artistic side, right?
Okay. Okay.
Artificer is how he describes Daedalus, right? He's an
Okay.
inventor. He's an
Okay.
inventor who
Yeah.
invented wings, right?
Yeah.
So the
Kind
myth
of.
of Daedalus is very significant in understanding portrait of the artist, right?
Okay.
So the major conflict that you find in the novel is between these two things: religion on one hand and art on the other
At the
hand,
other. Okay.
right?
So,
Artistic innovation, artistic invention.
yeah. So at the end, was there any result, or this dwindling continues?
There is a revolt, right?
Yeah.
There is a revolt, although the reasons for the revolt are, at least from an Indian's perspective,
Yeah.
it's a bit much,
Yeah.
because the kind of uh, operations that we go through,
Yeah,
right? Because
exactly.
the institution of family again is plays an important role in the book, right?
Mm-hmm.
When he
Mm-hmm.
decides to go to the university, his mother actually does not say
And
anything,
it does not say anything. Yeah.
right?
Mm.
She just remains quiet,
Quite.
right?
Yeah.
In India, for example, that's not possible. Parents will have an opinion, so they're
Yeah.
not going to sit quiet.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the revolt was essentially because no one had the right to judge him, right? Not his parents, not his friends, not anyone. He broke up
Not
with
this
everyone
person.
who tried to
Yeah.
judge him, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So we can't
So
afford it, basically.
there is a revolt because at the
Yeah.
end of portrait he leaves for Paris, right?
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
decides to leave for Paris.
Mm-hmm. So can we deduce the fact that since he decides to go to Paris, he's more lean towards that innovator side or the artistic side that we are talking of, and he breaks away from the religious
Yeah,
constraints.
yeah, he breaks away from that. He breaks
Yeah.
away from religion. In fact, there's a famous story. It's a real story.
Mm-hmm.
When the mother of James Joyce was on her deathbed, right? James Joyce had come back from Europe in order to see her. His brother Stanislaus Joyce also came with him, and both of them were standing there in the room when the priest was there, and the priest asked them to kneel, right? Kneel in prayer, and they refused to kneel even when the mother in her is in her deathbed. And this is what you find also in Ulysses, right? In Ulysses you'll find the same incident where the mother comes as a ghost in the dream of Stephen Dedalus, right? Because Stephen Dedalus in the novel has refused to
to abide by the laws
to
of
kneel
religion.
down, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, what you find, the thing that that is related to my topic is a fusion of past and present. You
Present,
have Daedalus, for example, the mythical character. You have Saint Stephen, the first Christian martyr, and they're both fused with someone in the present.
Yeah.
Right? You'll
And
find this kind of fusion also in the poetry of T.S. Eliot. Right? So
yeah.
why is this fusion important? It is again related with the theory of light. Right?
Okay.
Einstein, even when he was young, has always wondered what it would be like to travel on a beam of light.
On a beam of light,
Right?
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you travel on this beam of light, you travel outside your
Comfort
outside
zone or whatever.
no outside this outside
Atmosphere.
the earth, for example.
Earth, yeah.
Right. So what happens is that the time slows down, right?
Okay.
The time slows down, and you see an event that happened, for example, today, would actually reach him, right? Maybe many years later,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yes.
So he would come to know about it many years later. That
Many
is
years
why, for
later.
example, if not a time traveler, but someone who travels in space, right? And he travels at the speed of light, then he will not age, right?
Yeah.
He will age slowly as
Yeah.
opposed to his twin. That is the twin hypothesis in a sense, right?
Okay.
If he has a twin brother on Earth, for example, he would age much
He
more
will age
faster.
much faster, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay.
Hello.
Huh.
Hello.
Yes. Yes.
Sir, am I audible?
Yes.
Sir, my question is you talked about the difference between science and art that basically we have in India.
Huh.
We have a huge gap. So, my question is through the integration of scientific theories into literature, can this gap, especially in India, can it ever be breached?
I'm a kind of a pessimist, so I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But there are efforts being made outside India, right, where they have tried to. The moment I tell a person from science, even in my university, that this is my thesis, I've worked on relativity, quantum mechanics, chaos and complexity theory, I've applied them to literature, right? And the first reaction is incredulity, that they can't understand how this could be done and why this person is using scientific theories, right? But I believe that there's any development in any country, right, in the world, right, it cannot be uh, it cannot remain isolated, right? All the scientific developments, all the political theories, the philosophies that you find in the West, especially because uh, I'm a bit weak in the Indian context, Indian philosophy. So my area is mainly Western philosophy. So now, when you talk about Western philosophy, Western science, you'll see that there are conjunctions, correlations between scientific revolutions, scientific theories, and the novel or any other form of literature, right? There are relations, they cannot stay isolated, and they have never remained isolated. It is a misconception that has been believed for so long, right, that it has become true.
The isolation that we mainly have, it can be a construct of our own self. We feel that they are completely separate thing, but there can be an integration if we try to.
Yes, there can be integration, not only can be, but there have been efforts made to integrate both of these. Right?
Okay.
There have been efforts made to integrate both of these.
Okay, sir.
Right.
Thank you, sir.
Hello.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Hello.
Ha ha.
Hello.
Can I talk to Dr. Nag?
Hello.
Yes. Hello. Hello.
You are sir, you are requested to start the second lectures.
Just wait a bit. Let the interactive session be over.
Okay.
Okay. There. I think there are some questions.
Okay.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes. Hello.
I'm Dr. Hello. I'm Dr. Shishupal from Palampur, Himachal Pradesh.
Okay.
You are
Yes.
teaching a portrait of the artist as a young man. It seems to be a study of the conditions for an artist's creativity.
Yes.
You have talked various scientific terms to
Yes.
relativity and other things also. But how do you see that we find life of Graves and Greece in the life of Stephen Daedalus?
Sorry, I did
So
not
there is
understand the last part. Could you repeat the last part?
Graves, Greece,
Okay, Greece.
Graves and Greece.
Huh.
Yeah. So in its inner and outer life, so there is a kind of viscosity also. How
Okay.
do you see it?
Mm, Greece, as in what Greece are you
Greece,
talking?
Greece, Graves, viscosity in his life, in his inner life, outer life. Because otherwise, we talk about flight and images of flow and something which flows. It has
Okay.
its own, we can, yeah, speed. So there is
Okay.
not any kind of intervention in it. But we find that that very flowing tide is being stopped or is slowed down. How do you see it in the context of a portrait of the artist as a young man?
I'm not sure exactly what the question is, uh, but since my topic was about scientific theories and their influence on science, I
Okay.
would. Uh,
Okay.
I think it's better if we
So
stick to that area. I don't want to give a general kind of a I was not trying to interpret portrait of the artist. Right.
okay.
I was only
Then
trying to
that
pick. Yeah.
you might have gone through sign,
I was
signified,
giving.
signify.
Yes, I was giving a different perspective on the reading
Yeah.
of a portrait. Right. There are all kinds of
Yeah.
traditional readings of portrait.
You have talked about structuralism. There are signs, signified,
Hmm.
signifiers. How
Hmm.
do you see all these things in a portrait of the artist as a young man?
Uh, no, I've not actually talked about structuralism. Anyway, there is an importance that is given to linguistic ability in Stephen Dedalus in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. So, language plays an important role in trying to understand the world, to navigate through the world. Right. So, uh, mainly not the structuralism of Saussure in a sense, but what you find in Lacan is applicable to this novel. Right. Okay.
Okay, no problem.
Hmm.
But there are flights and flow images in the portrait of the artist as a young man. So while you are teaching, how do you teach all these theories of Newton, and relativity? And
No,
there is a term which
I don't talk about these things in class. I give
okay,
them I give them actually a very traditional understanding of the novel.
uh, it's a difficult novel.
I don't. It is a difficult novel, right? and you can only understand it if you read the novel. And I don't actually make it more complicated by talking about Newton and Einstein, and I don't talk about the influence of occult as well. This could be again another class where you talk about the influence of occult on Joyce, because Yeats generally is associated with the occult. So
Occultism.
James Joyce is never thought of as being part of any occult group. He was never a part of an occult group, but the occult played an important role in the novel. Right? That is where the universal memory that I talked about comes from. There are devices that he uses which tries to unify all the experience, right? Or the meaning of the text.
Okay, hello. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, first of all, this is a comment.
Okay.
I was reminded of one thing. In The Sisters, a story from Dubliners, Joyce used the word gnomon, and the word gnomon is directly taken from the sundial.
Yes.
So it can be. I thought when we were talking about the science, the correlation between science and literature. So that thing came to my mind, that gnomon is the object that actually causes the shadow, that bars the sunlight, and it causes the shadow and helps us to measure the time of the day. And Joyce has very successfully used this thing as an artistic technique, in which disappearances suggest the presence. And while we go through the stories of Dubliners, we find that gnomon thing in many of his stories. For example, in Araby, there are references to to many things, like a blind lane, and there is a bicycle pump. These free motifs are used to suggest some presence with the help of disappearances, with the help of absence. The second thing, I have one more thing to request to the audience. I request the audience to ask relevant questions. Try to understand the perspective of the speaker, and then frame your questions accordingly. The speaker has talked on the correlation between science and literature, and there are some questions about structuralism and so it creates a kind of confusion and difficulty. So I request humbly everyone to frame your question in a relevant way. Okay. Is there any other question?
There is actually someone who asked, what is so interesting about simultaneous actions? So, should I answer that?
Obviously.
What is so interesting about simultaneous actions? So, the problem is, most of the people, when they talk about modern literature, they view it as anti-realist in nature. They view it as anti-realist in nature, and most of the realist novels, right, are always showing you linear events, right? And this linearity is what is problematic, right? It is always a linear catalog of events that you find, right? Like the menu that I think what is it? Tom Jones, right? In Tom Jones, you have the menu, right? It's all linear, right? The book, you'll find, for example, an entire writings on the philosophy of the novel, right? Philosophy of the novel. The very form of the novel, right, is linear, right? You read linear. You don't directly jump to the end, although some people do jump to the end of the book, right? But you always deal with linear events, right? Not simultaneous events, right? You don't deal with simultaneous events because that will be far too complicated, right? So that is why you have realist novels. Robinson Crusoe, for example, begins with, I was born on so and so date, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, all linear events, right? The 28 years that he stayed on the island, all talked about linearly, right? There is no simultaneous action in a sense, right? That you find in modern novels, that you find in postmodern novels. They're almost obsessed with this entire concept of simultaneity, because simultaneity is more real than realism, right? Any kind of realism has to talk about this kind of simultaneity, right? When you talk about two major characters in a novel, for example, you have to talk about this kind of simultaneousness, right? Or generally in a world, right? If there are many characters in a novel, right, and many characters in the novel, the simultaneous action is very important, right? What they did at the exact time, and the person, the writer that I worked on, has an abundance of used an abundance of these examples, right? And James Joyce likewise has used the simultaneous events. It is important because it breaks away from the tradition of the realist novel. And Stephen Hero, in fact, was written in a realist style. That is why James Joyce threw it in the fire. Right. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hmm.
I think that we are running out of time. So
Okay.
without,
Okay.
yes, without losing time, I would like to go to the second slot. I
Okay.
would, yes, I would introduce Dr. Arnab Kumar Sinha. Dr. Arnab Kumar Sinha is an assistant professor, stage 2, in the Department of English and Culture Studies, the University of Burdwan, West Bengal. His teaching experience includes 10 years of teaching at the university level and 2 years of teaching at the college level. He has co-edited the books Indian Fiction in English, Mapping the Contemporary Literary Landscape. The book was published in 2014. Indian English Drama, Changing Canons and Responses. It was published in 2019. He has published 18 articles, essays in several international, national journals, books, and has also presented more than 20 papers at various national and international conferences, seminars. In 2019, he received funding from the German Association for Post-Colonial Studies and visited the University of Bremen, Germany, to present a paper on representation of sea in Indian diaspora. His forthcoming publication is an essay on the endangered diaspora, which will be published by Routledge, UK, in an edited volume. But besides these, I have to say something about Arnab because he is like my elder brother, and another thing is that he was my PhD supervisor. Okay, so these two identities of Dr. Sinha are very nearer to my heart than his academic excellence and his erudition in the literary field. So I would request Dr. Arnab Kumar Sinha to deliver his lecture. Sir, please.
Thank you, Sourav, for for this kind words and appreciating my achievements. Anyway,
My pleasure, sir.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and especially I would like to thank Sourav for insisting right from the beginning that I must speak, because I'm not quite conversant with this mode of seminar, and therefore I was initially a bit hesitant, and therefore at that point of time I told Sourav that maybe I won't be able to prepare any kind of presentation. But then when he insisted, then obviously I agreed. So my talk, I would obviously keep in mind the time limit, as it's 30 minutes. My talk actually focuses on Mamang Dai's poetry, and actually when Sourav invited me to present this particular talk, then at that point of time I was thinking about my research area, but then I also I discussed this particular topic, because Sourav was also saying that most of the people who would attend this particular seminar, they are mainly students, and if I speak on any particular topic that is there in the syllabus, so that would be a bit more productive for them actually. So I chose Mamang Dai, and I then obviously focused on the poem that they have in their syllabus at the UG level, which is titled Small Towns and the River. So primarily I shall, focus on this particular poem, but I shall refer to the other poems also, though I won't be able to explain, or rather, make a kind of a detailed explanation of, or give a kind of a detailed explanation of, those poems. But I shall, in my entire talk, try to focus on certain very important, perspectives that that I think will be helpful for the students, and that will encourage the students to, think the poems written by Dai, or to interpret the poems written by Dai in a different way. Now, before I actually begin, I would like to focus on a very important quotation. And this, I think, is important because this quotation shall introduce us to the entire area of the Northeast. And this is especially for the students, because students might not be quite aware with the literary trends in the Northeast. So I think it's necessary, and this is a quotation which is important because Temsula Au actually in 2006, said something very significant regarding the future of Northeast poetry, and not Northeast poetry in fact, but Northeast literature in general. And at that point of time, she in fact also was skeptical regarding the future of the tribal people residing in the various parts of Northeast. Because in 2006, as Temsula Au said, that was the time when already the impact of globalization was very much prominent, and Temsula Au was quite anxious about the future of these tribal communities. Because due to the impact of globalization, these tribal communities were slowly losing their identity, and there was a constant pressure from the center to become a part of the larger structure, the larger national structure. So this conflict between tradition and modernity is at the center of, I would say, the tribal community, and that point is clearly mentioned in this particular quotation. I would like to just refer to this quotation and then switch over to the other aspects which I would like to deal with. Now here, very clearly, Au says, the cultures of Northeast India are already facing tremendous challenges from education and modernization. In the evolution of such cultures and the identities that they embody, the loss of distinctive identity markers does not bode well for the tribes of the region. If the trend is allowed to continue in an indiscriminate and mindless manner, globalization will create a market in which Naga, Khasi, and Mizo communities will become mere brand names and commodity markers stripped of all human significance, and which will definitely mutate the ethnic and symbolic identities of a proud people. Globalization in this sense will eventually reduce identity to anonymity. So this is a major concern of Au. And this very anxiety that the tribal identity would at one point of time may become anonymous. This is something which is very, very important. And this anxiety, I would say, is very much pervasive in almost the entire Northeast literature. Because the Northeast poets, novelists, and playwrights, they have been dealing with this particular conflict between tradition and modernity. By tradition, I here mean obviously the tribal cultural tradition. And with the onset of globalization, with the change in the entire scenario of the nation, and obviously with the impact of technological innovations influencing India, and in that way, obviously the entire scenario in India changed in the post-liberation era, and that obviously did have a major impact on the mind and the psyche of these people, these tribal people residing in different parts of Northeast. Mamang Dai actually is a poet who lives in Arunachal Pradesh, and her poems obviously deal with the entire cultural dynamics associated with that particular region. And she belongs to a particular community which is known as the Adi community, the Adi tribal community. And in her poems, she has constantly presented this kind of anxiety. Where will this Adi community go in the future, or how will this Adi community in a sense evolve in a scenario where their identity is obviously at stake? Now, in this context, obviously the context, as you can very well understand at this juncture, is this clash between the tradition and modernity. In this context, I would like to refer to Victor Turner. Victor Turner, I won't be able to discuss at length Victor Turner, but because he is a very in a sense dense, he has some certain very dense philosophical insights, and if I if I deal with those philosophical insights, I would be in a sense digressing. But I would like to refer to Victor Turner's one very important book, which is titled The Ritual Process, Structure and Anti-Structure, where there is a chapter on liminality and communitas. Now, in this particular chapter, liminality and communitas, Turner actually talks about the concept of communitas. How this concept of communitas, which obviously Turner derives from the idea of community, and or the word community, he uses this word community and coins this word communitas. And he uses this word communitas, keeping in mind the fact that communitas is a more loaded word in a sense that communitas is anti-structure. Communitas embodies a kind of anti-structural sentiment. And there is a particular section in this chapter. The chapter, as I said, is titled Liminality and Communitas, where Turner actually tries to distinguish, this idea of communitas from, the structure. The structure, obviously, when Turner tries to define, means a homogeneous concept, the larger idea, and communitas is the smaller entity that tries to, in a sense, embody an anti-structure attitude. And he says that communitas has an existential quality, and it is very importantly evocative of the idea of it is importantly evocative of the subjunctive mood, unlike the structure, which Turner says is evocative of cognitive quality. So structure and communitas, if we take this kind of binary, or if you consider this kind of binary, is something which is very contextual in our discussion of Mamang Dai's poetry, because Mamang Dai actually has, I believe, in her mind, the national structure, the nation that obviously wants to, as Temshula has pointed out, as I said, wants to, in a sense, impose a kind of a homogeneous culture, and in a sense also, eradicate the so-called the tribal identity of these communities. So this is the national cognitive drive, or the cognitive quality, and as opposed to that, we find that this idea of communitas, which is very much present in her poems, obviously speaks about her subjunctive mood, her attitudes. And these attitudes are obviously, as Turner, in the context of this, dialectic between the structure and the communitas, says that it is very much subjunctive. That means it is expressive of its own attitude, and these attitudes are not always the attitudes of the institutional norms, but rather it seeks to, in a sense, challenge those norms. So if we take into account this particular idea of communitas, then it is obviously anti-structure, as I said, and it also seeks to establish a different kind of discourse, a discourse that is obviously different from the kind of national discourse or the larger discourse that seeks to, in a sense, eradicate the identity of the tribal culture. And obviously, if we consider this particular poem that is titled Small Towns and the River, then we can see that how this particular aspect of communitas, and most importantly how this particular conflict between tradition and modernity has been very well addressed by Mamang Dai in this particular poem. And before I actually begin my discussion on this particular poem, I would like to also refer to another very important poem, which I think is important in the context of our discussion, and that is titled Topu, T-A-P-U, Topu. Topu actually is a particular dance form in Adi culture, where obviously the dancers use swords, and swords obviously happen to be a very important marker of certain very important traits of Adi community. And while referring to this particular Topu dance, and obviously a particular form, a particular performative art, in this poem, Topu, it's a short poem. I'm not going to read the entire poem, but I would like to just refer to the last section of this particular poem, where Mamang Dai says, "Mark the sword, mark the sound. What are the words we will tell our sons and daughters? That dying is not so hard if the image survives." Very important. So he's saying that we should mark the, she's saying that we should mark the swords, and obviously mark the swords that are being used in this performance, and also sound. And then we should also keep in mind that this sword, this entire performance creates a kind of an image of the entire identity of the Adi community. And this, as Mamang Dai says, is permanent. So this permanent thing must remain. It must not vanish, because we will die. And that is what she's saying. She's saying that what are the words we will tell our sons and daughters? So she is obviously anxious about the future, because in future, this identity may be lost. And that's why she is saying that what is important is these markers, these images. And these obviously must remain. This must not die. This must obviously, must in a sense become immortal, though we may die, right? So we see that there is a very, very strong sense of anxiety working in the mind of the poet. And that same kind of anxiety is here present in this particular poem that obviously you have in your syllabus, Small Towns and the River. Now, at the very beginning of this particular poem, we see that Dai actually begins with a single line, which is very important. Small towns always remind me of death. Now, small towns, we must keep in mind here, the idea of town has been used by Dai in connection with the image of, obviously, or in connection with the idea of modernity or civilization. How modernity, in a sense, can erase the entire cultural identity of this particular tribe. So small towns, that means this particular place where they live, this particular place one day would be transformed into a town. And obviously, she says, and she has this kind of a vision in her mind, that small towns always remind me of death. Death of what? Death of, obviously, the tribal cultural past. So here, you can very well understand that there is a clear-cut distinction between nature and culture. And then after that, obviously, as you find, she says, my hometown lies calmly amidst the trees. It is always the same in summer or winter, with the dust flying or the wind howling down the gorge. Now, after the first line, you find that there is a full stop, and then there is a description about this hometown. So in the very first stanza, there is a distinction between the small town, the idea of small town that Dai talks about, which, as I said, is in a sense symbolic of modernity, symbolic of the larger structure which wants to erase the tribal past, eradicate the tribal past. And that's why, that small town reminds her of death. At the same time, pitted against this small town is the idea of hometown. Now, this hometown is quite peculiar, because this hometown, if you carefully read the description, this is a town which, in a sense, if you carefully go through the lines in the very first stanza, then this is a town which probably exists at the mental level of Dai. It is a town which resides in the mind of the poet. And that's why in this town, nothing changes. She says it's always the same in summer or winter, with the dust flying or the wind howling down the gorge. So this town is a permanent thing, is a thing that is etched in the mind of the poet, is a thing that is etched in the mind of the poet, is there in the mind of the poet. And this town, this hometown, obviously is changeless. So this hometown, in a sense, is a marker of, or is indicative of, the tribal cultural identity or the tribal cultural past. And how this hometown now, as Dai realizes, and as Dai says in the very first line, is in a state of crisis. So what is quite important is to understand this sense of anxiety. Also understand this particular, distinction between, change and non-change. So small town reminds her of death. So small town will totally change the entire scenario. It will bring about a huge change. And on the other hand, the hometown that she nourishes in her mind, which is a mental construct, is a kind of an idea that is changeless, that is permanent. So you can very well understand the conflict here. Conflict between change and changelessness. And then I'm going to the next stanza. Just the other day, someone died. In the dreadful silence, I'm just reading out the second stanza. In just the other day, someone died. In the dreadful silence, we wept, looking at the sad wreath of tuberoses. Life and death, life and death. Only the rituals are permanent. Very important. In the second stanza, you see that she is elaborating, her tribal, her association with the tribal culture. And, among the tribal people, death and people, being born, these are all usual things. So just the other day, someone died. That means a person in their community died. And there was a complete silence. That is what Dai says. And obviously, they all wept when this person died. And then after that, she says, life and death, only the rituals are permanent. You find that in the second stanza also, there is this, what you can say, this kind of, this kind of binary that exists between change and changelessness. So what is within the tribal community? People are dying, and they are mourning for those, for those people who are dying, and this obviously is something which is inevitable. So death is inevitable. Death is inevitable, but obviously what is important is the permanence of the rituals. Now, when she's saying that rituals are permanent, she's actually referring to the cultural rituals. The cultural rituals that they perform, they must remain. They must not vanish. They must not, these rituals must not be eradicated. So rituals are permanent. Performance of the rituals must continue. So when she's saying that rituals are permanent, we need to refer to that particular poem which I mentioned at the beginning of my discussion, Topu. That dance form where the performance use sword, and the swords clash, and there is a lot of noise. So those rituals must remain, and in that particular poem, Dai says that image is something which is immortal. Image is something which is important. So rituals or tribal rituals are permanent, though people in their community may die. That is something which is a part of a kind of a cyclical process. People will die. People will, new people, people will be, new people will come to this particular tribe. People will be, many people will actually, live in this particular community, and they will obviously become mature. So death, rebirth, or rather that cycle will go on. But what is important is the permanence of of these ritual performance of these rituals. And after this, you find that in the very next stanza, the third stanza, she says, the river has a soul. So there is a river, which, obviously Dai has in her mind. The hometown that she imagines has also a river beside it. The river has a soul. It knows. Now, it knows is a very, very loaded word. And it knows is significant because here Dai actually is talking about a shift in epistemology, an epistemological shift. Because knowing or knowledge, as we all know, is something which humans can have. So humans have knowledge, humans can interpret, humans can analyze. But can rivers know? Can trees understand? This is a question. And this question is seriously addressed by Dai here. The river has a soul, and then in the next line she says, it knows. So Dai is actually talking about an epistemological shift from the humans. So it's not only the humans know, the rivers rather know. The nature knows, the rivers know, mountains know. There are other poems of Dai where she talks about mountains, and where she in a similar way says that the mountains have witnessed the generations of these tribal communities. So here you find that how she is dislodging this particular notion that knowledge is something which only humans can have. Rather, the trees, rivers, mountains, and everything that is a part of the nature, they also know. And here also in this particular stanza, you can understand that there is a kind of a distinction being made between human knowledge and obviously the knowledge that the rivers can have, mountains can have, or the trees can have. Also important is the fact that in this distinction, humans obviously happen to be very much temporary in the sense that nature is something which is permanent. Because if we go through this particular stanza here, Dai says the river has a soul, it knows, stretching past the town from the first drop of the rain to dry earth and mist on the mountain tops. So river knows everything about how it actually has to flow. It knows how the weather changes, and most importantly, in the last two lines of this stanza, Dai says the river knows the immortality of water. So the water is immortal, and humans are mortal. So here again, she is bringing in that same kind of conflict between temporality and permanence. And most importantly, in this stanza, she is most importantly pitching on the very important idea of this epistemological shift. Why should humans always claim that they know? Nature also knows. And after this, in the next stanza, she is celebrating the tribal culture. She is providing images of celebration of tribal culture, though in a very brief manner. A shrine of happy pictures marks the days of childhood. So a shrine of happy pictures marks the days of childhood. It means when one looks at the past, here obviously Dai is looking at her childhood, and she can very well relate how she enjoyed her past, and obviously how beautiful were those days. But pitted against that particular colorful past, that past which Dai feels was a happy past, was a past where she was totally engrossed in different different rituals and performances associated with their community. That past is now at a kind of a juncture which is in a kind of what you can say in a state of dilemma. Because just after these two lines, Dai says, small towns grow with anxiety for the future. So the past was happy, and the present is shrouded with a dilemma. And in the future, small towns again, small towns is in a sense a recurrent kind of a phrase that she uses. And at the very beginning of this particular poem, she uses this phrase, small towns. So small towns, as I said, is symbolic of modernity. So small towns grow with anxiety for the future. So here there is a reference to a future apocalypse. So the past was happy, but this past, which obviously is symbolic of the colorful culture of the tribal identity or the tribal community, that may be totally annihilated. And that's why when she says small towns grow with anxiety for the future, here there is a reference to an apocalyptic future, a probable apocalypse. The dead are placed pointing west. And why this apocalypse? Why this feeling in Dai that probably in future there will occur an apocalypse and the tribal identity will be totally annihilated? Because now again she explains that in a very metaphorical way. The dead are placed pointing west. Now the word west here is again very significant. The word dead has here been used in a metaphorical sense. those are dead, or those people are dead, are considered dead here by Dai, who are dissociating from their tribal past. So the dead are placed pointing west, meaning those who are disconnecting themselves from the tribal community, or rather those who are no more keen on being a part of the tribal culture, they will die. Why they will die? Because Dai believes, because they will die because they will embrace the West. Now the West here does mean many things. It means obviously the aspect of Christianization. Very important, because Christianization, or the influence of Christianization, or the influence of Christian religion, played a very, very major role in annihilating the so-called tribal, numerous tribal rites and rituals. So the dead are placed pointing west indicates this this idea of dissociating from the tribal community and connecting with the West. The West, which is a signifier of Christianity. The West, which is a signifier of the fact that this Christianity is going to annihilate their culture, their tribal culture. Now, those who are not dead, or who will not, in a sense, dissociate from their own culture, from this particular tribal culture, what will happen to them? They will actually realize that the sun rises in the east, and that is what when the soul rises, that means those who realize that embracing Christianity or embracing modernity will not give them any kind of peace, but rather will, in a sense, confirm the annihilation of their original tribal past. Those who will realize this, obviously, they will, according to Dai, as he says here, when the soul rises, soul rises means it's a kind of, what you can say, re-awakening of the soul. When the soul rises, it will walk into the golden east. Just mark. So walking towards the east again is what you can say a kind of a position which can be considered as a counter enlightenment position, because the West is not only symbolic of Christianity, but the West is also symbolic of the entire epistemological discourse, the discourse that is based on reason. And this discourse will not address the various cultural nuances of this communitas. And that's why this communitas has to, according to Dai, walk towards the east. It's a counter enlightenment position. Because, as already pointed earlier in the poem, she's saying that the rivers know. She's not saying that we know. The rivers know. The nature knows. So it's a kind of a counter enlightenment position. And that's why she says, when the soul rises, it will walk into the golden east, into the house of the sun. Again, mark, people of their culture will walk east and will enter the house of the sun. Just mark. So river, sun will provide knowledge to this particular community, will be the source of their knowledge. And then finally the poem ends, in the cool bamboo restored in sunlight, life matters like this. So this is life, walking eastward, embracing the river, embracing the sun, and understanding that nature has its own epistemology. And obviously you can very well understand that this is also a kind of a poem that she is talking about an alternative epistemological discourse, which is, based on a typical, what you can say, topophilia, Now, topophilia again is a very loaded word, which obviously was used by Waifu and in the case of Dai, and as Waifu says that topophilia means an association with a particular place in such a way that the place itself becomes representative of a particular cultural identity. So it's a kind of, it's a place poetry, but at the same time, the place here assumes a significant emotive dimension. It becomes a marker of the cultural epistemology and also a marker of the tribal identity. And that's why she's talking about walking towards the sun and sun being their house. And then in the last two lines, in the small towns by the river, we all want to walk with the gods. Again, just mark, in the last line, she's not talking about a single god, but plural gods. Again, in the West, there is only one God. But here, she's saying that we all want to walk with the gods. We here is symbolic of this particular idea of communitas and walking with the gods. Different tribal communities have different gods. So this idea of, again, heterogeneity, and obviously not saying or not pointing out or not asserting that there is only one God, but rather every tribal community have different gods, and they have different gods, and the communities have different God, and they can walk with their own gods. So in this way, we see that this is a very, very loaded kind of a poem, and a kind of a poem which obviously draws our attention to the fact that how Dai, as a sensitive poet, is trying to build a different kind of a epistemological discourse, which is based on the idea of communitas, and also based on the fact that nature also can know. And if we consider, I don't have that much of time, but if we consider just the other poem, another poem, very important poem, which is titled An Obscure Place. Now this poem again is important because in this poem, we see that how she is, this poem is titled An Obscure Place. You can just read it. It's available in the internet. Here, she is not eager in stating the fact that they want to speak and they want to communicate. Rather, An Obscure Place is a kind of a poem of Dai where she is more interested in humans communicating with nature. So humans in this particular poem, An Obscure Place, are silent. It's nature which seems to be, talking to the humans. That's why humans are silent, but nature is eloquent. This is again another very interesting poem because obviously, as she has said in the title, it's an obscure place where humans don't speak, rather nature speaks. And nature takes the initiative in communicating with the humans. So in a sense, you find that in this particular poem, Dai is also rejecting this particular idea of logocentrism, our dependence on a particular language. Why should not we listen to the nature, how nature communicates with us? So there is a very, very strong connection between the community that she presents in these poems and how the community is so intimately associated with the nature. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your engaging lecture and illuminating interpretation on the poem and on the poetry of Dai in general. I would like to open the floor for the audience. If you have any question, you are free to ask now. Or
Yes, hello.
yes, okay.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
It's Devopriya. I think it's Devopriya. Okay, Devopriya, proceed.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Sir, you said that in the poem Small Towns and Rivers, there is an epistemological shift. Sir, what is that? I can't get. Sir, can you explain that?
Actually, the epistemological shift is there when she says that in the very third stanza, I said that, and Dai in fact points out that the river has a soul. So Dai is actually trying to point out that the river also is a kind of an entity that can think, that can know. The river has a soul. Just mark in the third stanza. She's in third or fourth. I think it's fourth stanza. 1, 2. No, it's in the third stanza. In the third stanza, she says that the river has a soul, and then no, sorry. In the fourth stanza, she says the river has a soul. It knows. So knowing, can the nature know? Now that is the thing which I pointed out earlier. Usually we consider nature as something which is mute, silent, something which is, she is here in a sense rejecting this anthropocentric attitude, because we humans always tend to consider nature as the other, as something which is silent. But here, Dai is saying that the river has a soul, and then she says it knows. So knowing is something which we all consider is there within the human domain. We know, we humans know, we learn, we interpret, right? But can the river know? Can the river interpret? Can the tree interpret? Usually we don't consider these questions because we have been in a sense programmed. Our mind has been in a sense programmed to think that rivers or trees, they cannot know. So here, there is a kind of an epistemological shift, a shift in terms of knowing. Who knows? Till now, we humans proudly said that we knew. But she's saying, no, the nature also knows.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
That is the shift.
Sir, may I add a comment on that?
Yes, Sourav, yes.
Yes, actually, Devopriya, epistemology is the study of knowledge, and traditionally it has been thought that human beings are connected with knowledge, and that epistemological thing is Western. In Hinduism, we can that our forefathers used to worship the banyan tree. The cohesion, the coexistence between nature and man was so old in Hinduism, and we have ever thought that nature is the reservoir of memory. We can die, the body goes back to nature, and where does the body go? The memory goes there. So nature is the reservoir of memory. It is preserving the memory of our forefathers. So we can unearth the past, we can unearth the cultural heritage only when we go to nature, only when we believe that a tree is not the other, as sir rightly pointed out. When we go to the tree as a reservoir of memory, only then we can go back to our culture. And in tribal culture, nature has ever played a very significant role. So that is the epistemological shift from human beings to nature.
Nature. Okay, sir. Thank you.
Yes.
Sourav, may
Yes,
I
sir.
put a question?
Of course, sir. Himadri
Sir.
sir is with us.
Yes.
Thank you, Arnab, for presenting a brilliant paper, really enlightening. But I was, as I was listening to your talk, I was thinking that the text, that I have not really read the text actually, but as I was listening to you, I was thinking that it is a narrative told by a person belonging to particular Adi community, and in the consciousness of that person, which is merged with the consciousness of the community, you see that there is no shift, in the sense that right from the beginning, the person knows that the nature is invested with meaning. Every object of nature, be that the hill, these hills called home, for example, in the home, that is nature, there is a kind of knowledge that the nature is the owner of all knowledge. Okay, so in the narrative, in the person's consciousness, there is one single commonsensical knowledge that the nature continues, that the nature has its own energy, nature knows all. But when he thinks of the West, only then he contrasts. Okay, from the West comes the death. Okay, so when he contrasts the local knowledge, the Northeast knowledge, with the Western knowledge that is coming in the form of globalization, so only then there is a kind of a shift. In the West, people know, people gather knowledge, okay, where the God may be dead. But in the Northeast culture, God is alive, and the people always are all eager to know everything, to have some knowledge from a single, even from single mute signs that the nature offers. This is my idea. What is your response to that?
Sir, I agree with this because, when she says in that, I think the second last stanza that people who the soul is rising and, they are all walking towards the east, she is talking about a counter movement. And what you said is, very true, because she is saying that their house is the house of the sun. And they are taking refuge in this nature. So nature providing them knowledge, providing them shelter, providing them all kinds of support, and community is totally embedded in nature. That is something which is very, very strongly pointed out in the second last stanza of this particular poem. And that is yes sir.
Another point that you mentioned is also very interesting, which is the home, what did you say? Town, small town. Okay?
Towns, yes. Small.
When you think of town, and in the Northwest, most of the places are small towns or villages, mainly villages, but then there are small towns. Small towns is also an in-between space between the villages and the
cities,
and the metropolitan cities.
So there lies the liminality.
From that point of view, small towns are really the liminal places. So it is a kind of space, a location from which he looks towards the West and who looks back towards the rural culture, the agricultural culture. So that is really an in-between space and liminal space.
Yes, sir.
When you think of Victor Thana, he speaks of communities, but he also speaks of stages and states. Okay,
yes, sir.
States are more or less permanent kind of condition, and stage is a kind of flux. You are moving, you are traveling. And when you read this kind of interpretation with Arnold van Gennep's rites of passage, you see that it gains meaning. It gains meaning in the sense that every human being, through the rituals, actually celebrates a particular moments of his life or her life or the community's life. And each important moment is marked by celebration through celebration of rituals. Rituals are very important kind of matter in the cultural lives of these tribes. So from that point of view also, you see, this is a moment, there must be some kind of ritual. Okay, he's looking back to the old ritual, and he's thinking of the future invasion or present invasion from the West. And what is emerging is probably a kind of idea about what kind of ritual we should follow right now. That is not said overtly, but that might be in the mind as well. This is my comment.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes, yes, yes. I agree with you, sir, because there is a sense of anxiety. There is a sense of anxiety, and regarding these rituals also, what kind of rituals they must actually perform in the liminal space. Because as you rightly pointed out, that she believes that the entire community is right now posited in this liminal space, small towns. And the small towns obviously can be converted to the future cities. And most importantly, regarding this performance of rituals, there is a kind of an anxiety. What kind of rituals? In fact, I mentioned therefore this poem, Topu, where, she is asserting the importance of this image, sounds of the swords, and the swords, in fact, the sword as an image, how that image stands as an important signifier of their culture. So will that be a permanent image? So she is questioning, because in that poem she says, what are the words we will tell our sons and daughters? So there is a kind of a conflict, there is a kind of a interrogation that is going on in her mind.
Hello.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Yes, I think.
Hello.
Yes.
Do
Yes.
you think that there is a kind of a rootlessness in the poetry, in this poetry? And Eliot says that only we can get the spirituality in the Indian context from various you can say those mantras from the Upanishad, da.
Actually,
Shanti,
rootlessness.
Shanti.
No, actually, I don't think this particular poem, in a sense, evokes the idea of rootlessness. In fact, I would say that this is a kind of a poem where the poet actually is focusing more on the future. The entire community has not been, derooted. It is in a state of transition, and it is in a kind of a situation where probably in future there will be an apocalypse, because in the poem she says that the future is dark, and the entire identity of their community may be eradicated. So there is a possibility that the entire identity may be eradicated. But right now, when Dai actually writes this poem, she feels that they are in that particular liminal space where there is a very strong urge to hold on to the past, but at the same time there is this pressure of the present modernized culture, post globalization culture, which is influencing the entire community to change and adapt, and thereby leave behind their tribal identity. So the entire community is not rootless in a sense. There is a kind of a dilemma, there is a kind of an anxiety, but obviously she is anxious about the future.
Yeah,
it's a kind of a state where she is stuck between the past and the future, right?
Past and future, from the east to the west and again to the east.
Yes,
kind of shifting.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there any other question? Hello.
Yes, sir.
Is there any
Hello.
other question? Yes.
Hello.
Yes.
Sir, as we know that many Indian tribal religion often reconcile with one or another more than major religious tradition like Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and pressurize themselves, pressurize the culture assimilation. But in this poem, why only the Christianity is pointed out in inhalating the tribal past?
Why? Because Christianity had a very big impact, or made a very big impact in the Northeast. If you go to the Northeast, you would see that how many people, in a sense, have been converted into Christianity. So that is a major concern for them, because Christian influence, or the Christian religion made a very big impact in the northeastern states. So you always find that they are quite anxious about the influence of this Christian religion, not the other religions.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Does anyone ask any more question? Hello. So, sir, I think that the interactive session is now over, and we are already running out of time. So we should
Yes.
call it a day. Yes, it's post lunch session also. So, sir, so I request everyone to return back tomorrow at 12 sharp, and for tomorrow we have 3 slots. Let me tell you the names of the guest speakers. Tomorrow we are going to have, okay, sorry, 2 slots are there. The first one, in the first slot, Professor Gautam Buddha Sural will deliver his lecture. And Gautam Buddha Sural is a professor of English from the Bangalore University. And in the second slot, Dr. Shreya Bhattacharya from the Central University of Jharkhand will be delivering her lecture. So let us meet tomorrow. And some people from the audience were asking me by mail when we shall issue the e-certificates. We shall issue the e-certificates after the 6th of June. Okay. And I have a very interesting thing to announce on the last day of this web lecture series. So wait for that. I must keep your suspense intact. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Arnab Kumar Sinha, for delivering such a beautiful and engaging lecture. Thank you, sir. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.